This is the 8th video in a series on collaborative world building, and I'm assuming viewers will have watched those videos and are familiar with some of the world building terminology that I use. This video is on creating a map for your fictional world. Earlier on in the world building process, when determining your world scope, I discussed the concept of breadth, or the physical extent of your world, and its depth, the level of detail in certain areas. The map is a visual representation of your world scope, including its focal points, or those areas that get the most attention. Throughout this video series, I have been constantly referring back to real-world locations, using Wikipedia as a model for your world based on its scope, and I'm going to do something similar now that we get to the map. That is, using real-world locations for mapping purposes. Now, when it comes to making custom maps, there are lots of options. Online mapping software, world templates you can purchase, and advice on drawing your own maps, and this video isn't really going to get into any of that. I'll show you a couple of very easy ways to use real-world locations for your maps using free software, but really the most important thing has to do with how the map functions, which is to provide a canvas for emergent and environmental storytelling, which I'll talk about in just a minute. One quick easy trick for creating a map of your world is simply modifying a real-world map. For example, the fantasy world I use in collaborative world building for writers and gamers as my example features a pair of rival cities in the desert, so I use an altered map of Arizona and the cities of Phoenix and Tucson as my model. In an earlier video, I did something similar with the areas around Argentina and Uruguay. Now, it's easy to create a new map in Google Maps and share it with your collaborators so you can all add markers or edit the map. But the downside is that Google really locks down the customization options unless you tinker with the API, which goes well beyond the scope of this video. You can change the base map easily enough with their predefined templates, but at the time of recording this video, none of them remove all the labels from the map, so it ruins the fantasy feeling you're going for if your map says Denver on it. Now, this isn't an issue for fantasy worlds, post-apocalypses, dystopias, and other worlds that might be perfectly fine using maps of our real world, so don't rule out Google Maps as it works really well for those kinds of worlds. Mapbox is also free and gives you tons of customization options in terms of altering colors, removing labels, changing other aspects of the map style. The problem here is that adding collaborators is more complicated, as is dropping interactive markers, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So what I do is I'll use Mapbox to change up the style, remove the labels, and then use screen capture software to just grab an image. Of course, you can always draw your own map, and there are many other mapping products out there. One of the easiest ways of handling your map is to build your world in free online software called WorldAnvil. Not only does it function like a wiki to keep your entries organized, but WorldAnvil's built-in mapping feature allows you to drop markers and links to entries, which is the most important part of having this map. They also have a nice article that reviews some of the current custom mapping options that are out there that I linked to in the video description. So back to this broader question, why have a map at all? First off, having a map in the front of the book is a mainstay for fantasy and science fiction novels, so readers can have a visual reference to the world and in many cases to track the protagonist's journey from place A to place Z. But for a collaborative world building project, there's a more practical purpose, and it draws from the concept of emergent and environmental storytelling, terms that I'm borrowing from the world of game design. An emergent story is one that emerges from a player's decision-making when confronted with open-ended choices. It's not scripted, but instead emerges from situations in the environment. Environmental storytelling is more or less loading up a game with lots and lots of story-making potential material that players come across and then can choose to use or interact with. Environmental storytelling also means that the map can give clues that have to do with conveying a world's history. The concept of emergent gameplay and environmental storytelling work together to provide players with a game world with lots of cool options to assemble their own stories. And yes, these types of games usually involve traveling across a map. If you've been following the collaborative world building process, your catalog should have a whole bunch of people, places, and things that feel very much as organic parts of that world. If you worked from broad to specific, these entries should feel connected and part of a whole. The map is a visual tool to establish those connections, especially the spatial relationships between locations. Once you've got your base map, start dropping markers on it and link those markers to your entries. Usually that's going to be locations, but sometimes you have people or things marked on your map too. The idea is to load up the map with markers that, in their own way, tell the story of the world. Do certain groups in a society live or work in certain areas of the map? Are certain locations more dangerous? As you drop markers, start to think about those spatial relationships you're creating. Is that holy site a day's walk out of town? How long would it take a character to get from their home to an enchanted forest? What would they encounter along the way? I often say that my job is helping students find stories. The map can help creators find the most interesting stories simply by asking them to think about different characters being in or traveling through or between different parts of the map, parts that have different social structures and different forces. In my world building classes, I'll randomly draw 2 characters, 2 locations, and an item from a student's world, and then have them write a scene describing how and why these characters would encounter each other at that location. Sometimes it makes perfect sense, and sometimes it takes a little bit longer to think through. What would be the circumstances that would bring that character to that location, and what would they have experienced along the way? But if your world is coherent and consistent, there should always be some logical connection linking your entries to the physical world they inhabit. Exactly how you make your map is less important than having a map and plotting out where those people, places, and things are in the world. Using real-world locations simplifies things a bit too, in that you could model your climate and geographic features after real-world places. But really, the most important thing is that you should see dozens of potential stories emerging from the map. Telling those stories is the subject of the next video on drawing stories from the catalog. Thanks for watching, and happy world building.